The third part of the presentation looks at the ignition of the immune system. Once the information is received by the immune system that there is a foreign cell to be attacked, how this information is translated into action. This is a process of ignition, which allows the immune system to begin generating an immune response. All right, so how does it all start? It all starts again with an antigen-presenting cell connecting with an immature T cell and creating an activation response. So we talked about this before. Antigen-presenting cells, the dendritic cells that are found in the first lines of defense for our body, the Langerhans cells, Galt cells, pneumocytes, are able to identify things that are self from non-self, migrate into a lymph node, transfer the information to an immature T cell, start a clonal response in which it starts. It forms the clones of a cell which are sensitive to that antigen, and then from that point, the cells are released back into the bloodstream as the effector cells to fight the antigens and prevent disease. Nonetheless, this is a B cell surface, and this is a T helper cell. B cells will also function as antigen-presenting cells. And the point of this is that the surface membrane, there's a lot of busy things that are going on to transmit information. And once the information is transmitted through that lipid bilayer, which we have to keep nice and soft with phosphatidylcholine, if it isn't nice and soft, then these receptor sites don't line up correctly, so you don't get the message transmitted. That's an important point. But once the message gets communicated, then we have a ligand that connects to a receptor which triggers a whole bunch of intracellular activity that results in genetic activation with specific genes producing certain proteins like cytokines. Some of those T cell receptors are referred to as TLRs. TLR stands for toll-like receptor. I'm sharing this with you because if you look at any current issue of the Clinical Journal of Immunology, I probably should have brought some of those. It uses terms like this. If you want to know what kind of medicine you're going to work with next year, you can read the journal articles now and see what they're thinking about, and then you'll understand better how to use it. That's kind of where we're trying to go to, for better or for worse. Okay, so toll-like receptors were first discovered and researched on Drosophila, okay? Everybody remembers those little critters. All right, so they found there's a bunch of different toll-like receptors that are on the surface of some membrane receptors and also in endosomes. And when it engulfs something that's foreign, then these are toll-like receptors in there that can be used to figure out how these things are working. And as you can see, this is published in a very recent article in the Journal of Oncogene, which is looking at, obviously, cancer immunology. And the reason it's looking at it because the different toll-like receptors have different effects. So when you stimulate these guys, what do? Well, they stimulate NF-kappa B. Remember that from this morning? When NF-kappa B gets stimulated by those toll-like receptors, you can have bad things happen from the point of view of fighting cancer. On the other hand, if these toll-like receptors get stimulated, then in a different pathway and results in an anti-tumor effect. So it is stimulating. The toll-like receptors 7, 8, 9, 3, etc., the effects are different and results in a better outcome from the point of view of fighting cancer. Now, one of the mediators for this are the type 1 interferons. Type 1 interferons are a fancy way of saying alpha interferon, beta interferon, etc. But for some reason in medical literature, they refer to them as type 1 interferons. Gamma interferons are type 2, but that's another story. But the type 1 interferons will act as a co-stimulator, as a second message. Remember, I said it takes more than one second message, to help determine which of these toll-like receptors are going to get hit. Now, one of the interesting things, as an aside, is that here you can see LPS in bacteria. Well, the interesting thing is that when you give somebody BCG basically hits all of these TLRs. And the thing that determines whether it's going to help support the bladder cancer or have a potent, very potent anti-cancer bladder effect is the balance of the secondary messengers and the amount of inflammation in that epigenetic intracellular milieu. So this is pro-inflammatory and this is anti-inflammatory and anti-cancer. This is just another way of saying the same thing, that when you hit these receptors, you have to wake up the dendritic cells. Here's your type 1 interferons we just mentioned. Now, all of a sudden, you block. There's a blocking symbol, block angiogenesis. You stimulate natural killer cells. You stimulate cytotoxic T cells and the cytotoxic dendritic cells, and you wind up with tumors that look like that, okay? You stimulate these guys, and you wind up with NF-kappa B then you wind up in a worse place. Where was I? Okay, but the point is they have drugs that they're doing research on right now to hit these different TLRs. So in the very near future, you're going to see drugs that are available to stimulate TLR9, which is an anti-cancer toll-like receptor as an adjuvant agent to your armamentarium, so that if you're doing a test on somebody and they're developing tests with this tube where the particular pathway of inflammation is activated and uses TLR drug, then you have a very potent, targeted in a specific way to shut down that cancer. That's the critical relevance of this. Again, we're still at step 1 with antigen-presenting cells, which are macrophages primarily, and dendritic cells, which we heard about a little bit before. They're hitting at, there's a connection here with these other receptors. As I said, it takes 2 messengers for things to happen. The MHC major histocompatibility complex is part of that. And then there are other molecules that work in order to make that bridge and to turn things on. Once the antigen-presenting cell is turned on, it starts releasing interleukin-12, interleukin-1, which is pro-inflammatory, TNF, which is pro-inflammatory. It can also release interleukin-2. Interleukin starts the cascade of the whole immune counterattack to the cancer. So there's a balance between this and these guys. And again, the balance is to a very large extent determined by the balance of fatty acids, the omega-3s, the omega-6s, that I was talking about before. If someone, as I said, this all comes back together, what I was trying to do is give some information to understand as to how to turn these things on and off. Well, because when an antigen-presenting cell gets stimulated, it produces all of that, but half of this, or 2/3 of that, is bad from an anti-cancer point of view. If we're trying to kill MRSA, that's another story. If you try to kill cancer, you don't want this stuff. So how do you control the balance? The way you control it is very simple, with the balance of omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids, which is one of the points I was trying to make this morning. So this all comes back together. It fits. That makes sense. All right. So phagocytic index, I mentioned that before. This is a way of measuring the activity of macrophages. At this point in time, there is no blood test that is available to measure the activity of dendritic cells. There's that experimental test that I showed you before, which will test for certain kinds of dendritic cells. The plasmacytoid dendritic cell in the blood, which is not very useful if you're trying to kill a solid cancer, okay? So what we do in a backhanded sort of way is that we watch the phagocytic index because this is a reflection of phagocytic activity, including the activity of antigen-presenting cells, which are dendritic cells, and the macrophages. So if this is low, then you can bet that the person isn't processing antigens very well. So then that comes back to what I said earlier with GCMAF and the beta-1,3-glucan, etc., etc. You see where it's starting to come together a little bit, I hope. Okay, so B cells. B cells can also act as antigen-presenting cells. And they also have a second messenger, okay? Here's your major histocompatibility complex 2, type 2. And here's the second message that's required in order for the B cells to transmit the information. Remember, the MHC complex has a little bit of antigen on it. There's a little bit of the foreign material. It binds to the T cell receptor on the Th0 cell, and this helps turn on the process. And all that intracellular stuff goes on that I showed you a few slides ago. And what this does when it starts, the T helper cell, Th0 in the literature, depending upon the balance of the epigenetics, it seems it's either going on in the direction of a Th1 or a Th2 cell. And this is what I just said a little bit in an expanded way. But you'll see here where the toll-like receptors are playing more of a role and some of the effects that they have in terms of the selection of cytokines that are released and the cells that are taken from memory cells, etc., etc. You'll see drugs winding up in this class before very long, for induction, for maturation, for stimulation. It's just showing again that Viscum L preparations stimulate the maturation activation of human dendritic cells. Now, this research of Viscum goes back to 1925. They've been doing studies on it to figure out how this stuff works, because it covers a lot of different bases. It's also a true immune modulator, meaning that it can help balance both sides of the immune system, so that if the immune system is out of balance, either Th1 or in the Th2 direction too much, it can help bring it back into balance. It is not directionally dedicated. It's a non-conditional modulator. If you're going to be looking at diseases like multiple sclerosis, which is a Th1-mediated autoimmune disease, so that's a situation where you want to bring the Th1 and Th2 back into balance and balance out the Th1 cells. What we've been talking about on the other direction, but if you want to balance it out, Viscum will help you because it's a true immune modulator. It's not a stimulant. It's a modulator. It can help bring it back into balance. So, okay, this is an example of B cells, B cell markers, CD19, 20, 21, and 23. See, the CDs 20, 21, 22 are all running low. They're getting chewed up over here, and the reason they're getting chewed up over there is because there's an active cytomegalovirus in the person's system chewing the hell out of those B cells. CMV and EBV are two nasty B cell viruses that cause problems. So we'll see in a second. Here's an example of an active Epstein-Barr and one of the ways to go. Two ways to go, sorry. Here we go again. B cell viruses, Epstein-Barr and cytomegaloviruses are B cell viruses. So what does that mean? It means that they live in B cells, the cells that are supposed to make the antibodies that are used to destroy them. Fine. If you do a blood test for titers for EBV and CMV, you can come back with very low titers. Why? Because if you go back to here and the virus is destroying the cells that are supposed to be making those antibodies, you're going to get false negatives. Everybody see that? Okay. So that's why they're developing other tests like a PCR, which doesn't depend upon an immune response to see whether or not the virus is present. Now, also, as the immune system overcomes the virus and puts it into remission, which is very important because going back to 1956, Epstein-Barr virus was the very first virus to be identified as an oncogenic virus. That it was identified with nasopharyngeal carcinoma and Burkitt's lymphoma. So these are bad critters, okay? So you want to put this thing back to sleep. So the point is that once you start putting the thing back to sleep, you support the immune system. How? Well, okay. Obviously, oxidative therapy is wonderful against viruses, as is vitamin C, as is zinc, as is lysine, vitamin A, etc. The point is, as the immune system starts to rebuild itself using a lot of the techniques that we talked about this morning, as it starts to get itself back together, antibody production increases. Therefore, if you're tracking EBV and CMV, you get what's called a reverse curve, which means that the person is getting better, the antibody levels are actually going up, not down. If you're fighting a strep infection, if you're tracking ASOs, those numbers better be going down, right? You all with me? But okay, if you're fighting a B cell virus, initially those numbers have to go up, and they're going to go up because the B cells are now functioning better. At some point, it's going to reach an equilibrium with the virus. Get ahead of the virus, then you'll see the titers come back down. The IgMs will disappear. The IgGs will stay there for life, holding the virus in a state of remission, because it's in the herpes class of viruses. Once you got it for life. But the IgG antibodies can keep it in a state of remission for the rest of your lifetime and maybe the next. Sorry for the diversion, I can't help myself. So these are some of the blood tests that I want to look at, but I'm looking at B cells, okay? I'm looking at antigen-presenting cells. I'm going to try to stimulate some of the antigen-presenting cells and the dendritic cells. This is Aldara. This is what I was talking about before. You get it from a drugstore in a cream, but it's available as a powder that your compounding pharmacy can make for you. That's a whole nother discussion. And this is beta-1,3-glucan. So these things are available through compounding pharmacies and for stimulating the antigen-presenting cells in some rather dynamic ways. Look at the treatment protocol. Again, it comes back to what we said earlier this morning. Interleukin-2, GCMAF, and Pneumovax intradermally 0.01 every other day until you get a reaction, and then try to give this stuff. Give a combination intratumorally or give it as an injection in the arm and get more of a systemic response. This is how you're going to get your antigen-presenting cells back online. Now, once the antigen-presenting cells are back online, what happens is they stimulate the lymphocytes. So there are different tests that we measure the activity of lymphocytes. So the two tests we want to watch is a lymphocyte mitogen proliferation panel. So that's what this is. That's actually this one. So we're using different mitogens, phytohemagglutinin, concanavalin A, pokeweed mitogen. These are all herbal things, actually, herbal extracts that you can use in conventional medicine because they stimulate the clonal response of lymphocytes. So what happens is that When you put these things in culture, then what you'll see is that these cells will immediately begin to multiply. They'll form colonies. They'll form clones. And that's a normal response to a mitogen. And if somebody's really sick and their lymphocytes can't respond to the mitogen stimulation, and then you can stimulate your antigen-presenting cells with a gallon of GCMAF and nothing will happen. If you stimulate those APCs with whatever, there's a lot of stuff out there about GCMAF as the cure-all, and it is not the cure-all, because if you're looking at a lymphocyte mitogen proliferation panel like this, where the normal range is greater than 76,000, the person is weighing in at 246, you got a problem. These lymphocytes can't respond, no matter how stimulated the antigen-presenting cells are. One of the ways of getting these things back online, of course, Viscum stimulates mitogenic response. This is one of many ways to help prepare that. There's another test called a lymphocyte antigen stimulation index. That's the second test you want to watch. Lymphocyte antigen stimulation index, okay? And what that test does is it takes some common antigens that we're all exposed to, puts them in cultures with lymphocytes to see if the lymphocytes are able to produce cytokines in response to that antigenic stimulation. So in this example, here the normal range is greater than 3. This person is running at 1.1. So again, the lymphocytes can't respond. Then you can stimulate those antigen-presenting cells, but from now until cows come home, nothing will happen. How do you turn these cells back on? Well, that comes back to what we were discussing before. What suppresses the immune system? There are only 5 things that suppress the immune system: poor nutrition, infection, toxin, trauma, and stress. That's the key. It's that very easy key to remember. If you take the first letter of each of those words, you have an acronym of the PITS, because it's easy to remember because it's the PITS to be sick. You have to address that if you're going to turn the immune system back on. Poor nutrition, infection, toxin, trauma, stress. That's the stuff we were talking about this morning. All right, so we've gotten through to stage 1. We've activated the antigen-presenting cells. We've gotten 3. We then did a blood test to see that the lymphocytes can respond with a clonal response. So now you can make more lymphocytes, because it takes a lot of lymphocytes to fight cancer. And those lymphocytes that you're making actually are active. And they have their swords and their weapons, and they can potentially fight, okay? This is actually what this test is telling us, if they can fight. These cells can fight. So once we have activated the lymphocytes, I can go to a variety of different pathways. So we're just going to look at the first one, which is the Th2 pathway. And this is, from my point of view, as I said earlier, the default pathway of the immune system. And it's a default pathway because from an evolutionary point of view, the things that killed us were infectious things. And as a result, the immune system is hyper-primed to respond in the direction that protects us from infections. So when the immune system is triggered a little bit, the Th2 cells become activated. Activates all these wonderful cells that are the myeloid part of the immune system. Eosinophils, mast cells, basophils, and it also activates the B cells. B as in boy, the cells that make antibodies. We go through evolutionary pathways and wind up with a plasma cell over here, which is pumping out tons and tons of antibodies that are targeted where and whenever the antigen-presenting cell stimulated the immature cell with. So B cells, as I said before, B cells can take a hit. In this case, here we see Epstein-Barr virus early antigen, IgM positive. So this is active, knocking out the B cells. And that's a problem which can be dealt with in a lot of different ways, as I said earlier. Viscum can also help with that. When we have low B cells, the second thing that we have is low antibodies. You start running low IgG antibodies, Ig antibodies. You're losing your lines of defense to protect you from those infections. You lose enough of those things and you wind up with an illness called common variable immunodeficiency, CVID. It's fairly common, hence its name. Now, CVID results when there's a loss of one or more subclasses of antibodies of IgG or IgA. Efficacy of B cell structure, function, or activity, which is basically what all this is just about. So, hypogammaglobulinemia, low levels of IgG, IgA, are the kind of things that you get. So, if you take a look at some of these things, are really common. So, we have recurrent infections, we have fatigue, we have irritable bowel syndrome over here, and we have recurrent H. pylori over there, and so on and so forth. A lot of stuff that I'm sure you're seeing in your office because it's a common thing, hence its name. But it occurs when the B cells have specifically taken a hit. So why is this important to our discussion about cancer? Well, It's important for a lot of reasons. Number one, when the immune system gets stimulated, the antigen-presenting cells see a target. They process the target, they release interleukin 12. Interleukin 12 hits the immature Th sub-zero cell, starts an immune cascade. The immune cascade goes down to the Th2 cells. The Th2 cells stimulate the B cells. B cells make the antibody to fight the target. Now, the B cells have taken a hit because of toxins, like heavy metals that I showed you before this morning, or because of a virus infection, which happens, they don't make enough of those antibodies. So what happens? Remember that big green thing I showed you with a million arrows all over the place? And I said, this is a giant, cyclic, self-supporting immune system diagram? That really is true. So if the B cells aren't making enough antibodies, those antibodies can't feed back to the Th2 cells and inhibit them. So if the Th2 cells are missing the feedback inhibition, what's going to happen? They're going to start revving up higher and higher. And as they rev up, and as they rev higher, the cytokines that are related to Th2 cells go to the freaking moon. So when the Th2 cells become too very, very active, these things start going up. Then it throws the whole immune system out of balance, and you wind up with a Th2 dominant immune system. The short-term problem is that what this is in a blurry sort of way, that's IgE. Normal levels of IgE are less than 114 in adults. This one is 2,599. But this is one of those things that happens when you lose the feedback inhibition. I have allergy patients with even worse numbers than that. What happens then? Well, your histamine starts going up. How do you think the person's going to feel? Give him a tissue. He's about to sneeze again. Okay, not good. So putting it all together, so the Th2 cells are supposed to control certain things that are helping us. They're supposed to help us trap things that are foreign to us that we're exposed to through our lungs so that we don't get infections, so that we don't get increased mucus production, traps bacteria and viruses. We excrete it. We don't get pneumonia, which is a nice thing. And it's supposed to cause vasodilation so that it can get more elements of the immune system into the area where there's an infection, right? That's what your basophils and eosinophils are doing. And it stimulates B cell maturation so we can make more antibodies to protect us, so on and so forth. That's what's supposed to happen. Now, if it doesn't have the feedback inhibition from the antibodies to shut this down, what happens is that these levels start getting higher and higher. And what it does is it drives the levels of systemic inflammation to the moon, and these are the people who are going to have a SED rate of 120. It's like that. Oh, my God. And then there's no way of stopping a cancer stem cell when somebody's got a SED rate of 120 because their interleukin 13 is 400. You got to get it back under control. So, in the short picture, again, and this says that B cells, they get stimulated, they grow, they develop, they make different kinds of antibodies. These antibodies have different kinds of effects. The antibodies are very specific. An antibody made against antigen X will not react against antigen Y. They're very specific antigens, so that's why there's lots of different clones. But these antibodies have different effects, and one of them is to protect us. It has a memory effect. Remember the 3 jobs of the immune system: recognize, respond, and remember. That's one of the things that some of these B cells do. So when you first get a tetanus shot, you get a nice response and an anti-tetanus antibody. When you get a booster shot, that response now goes much faster. It has a much shorter delay. Instead of days, it's hours, and the response is much higher. Then, as a result of that, you're producing more of these antibodies, and then ultimately, as a result of that, you wind up with a generation of memory cells, which maintains a level of immunity. See, this line doesn't come back down to the baseline over here. You guys see that? It's staying at a level over here, so it's maintaining a level of immunity. So if you step on that rusty nail again, bang, it's going to shoot right back up, and you won't get lockjaw. So the different antibodies that the B cell can make, IgG, it neutralizes bacteria and toxins. It's very important. Remember it talked about bacterial toxins? Well, that's an IgG response. It works with natural killer cells to destroy cancer cells. Feedback inhibition. And then IgM, of course, is an acute response antibody against viruses and bacteria. But one of the things that IgM does is it activates the classical pathway of complement. And we heard about that this morning. Systemic inflammation again. IgA is a mucosal immunity antibody response. IgE antibody is something that's going to cause eosinophils, mast cells, and basophils to react. It causes the release of vasoactive amines and the whole allergy response thing. Now, the immune system can go through a process called isotype switching, which means that once the B cells get activated, they can actually change the type of antibody that they make, depending upon the amount of feedback inhibition and what they're receiving from other cells that are out there. Now, interferon alpha, beta, these type 1 interferons enhance B cell receptor dependent B cell responses. So what we know is that if we give someone with interferon alpha or interferon beta, we're going to stimulate a B cell response. So why is this important? Well, because B cells are obviously an important part of the immune system. They play an important anti-cancer role, and at times we're going to want to stimulate them. Furthermore, those phase 1 trial recombinant type 1 interferons in cancer patients, and it goes on, etc., and it said they saw some objective evidence of response, etc., and that alpha interferon by itself had some useful clinical activity. By itself, it doesn't do a whole hell of a lot, but it does have some activity. And unfortunately, the drug model that the FDA uses does not work well when you're testing biologics, because that green chart I showed you with all those arrows in a self-supporting cyclic thing. Nothing here works in a linear fashion. It's all cyclic. So when you're testing biologicals with a drug model, which the FDA does, the results are very screwy. It takes a long time to figure out, and people suffer needlessly. Anyway, so these are some of the interferons that's available. At this point, PEG interferon is used quite a lot. There's gamma interferon. I use this stuff all day long. Rebif, I use intron A. Intron A is one that's available. Now, O7A was one that was biologically produced. It had a spectrum of interferon subunits and worked much better than anything on the market today from an anti-cancer point of view. But it was much more expensive to produce. So when they figured out how to teach an E. coli how to make alpha interferon, they switched it. So with these lab tests, what we're looking at is we're trying to get an idea how the B cells and Th1 or Th2 cells are working. So again, it all starts with the CBC. You want to see what your B cell counts are doing. You're looking at the antibodies that they're producing. You're trying to get an idea how much inflammation they're causing in response to that inflammation. And you're trying to get an idea of the balance and that's in terms of what's regulating the immune pathway. Treatment is pretty straightforward. From the things that we discussed before, coming back this morning to things that have an antihistamine effect. Echinacea, zinc, lysine, of course. They help to support B cells. Zinc and vitamin A are anti-inflammatory and stimulate the production of IgA. So if you have someone that has recurrent cold sores, a zinc lozenge, vitamin A, and some probiotics are just the cat's meow for that.